All right, guys, welcome back. So today we are going to wrap up the Progressive Era with a discussion on the successes and the failures of the time period. So we'll start with the successes. We see a lot of positive changes during the Progressive Era when it comes to fixing some of the issues of the Gilded Age. Some of that is because of some muckraker publications. So people like Ida Tarbell, who was attacking the trusts and monopolies of the time period. Lincoln Steffens, who exposed, some government corruption and wanted people to fight it with the power of the vote. And Upton Sinclair, he wrote The Jungle, which exposed the meatpacking industry and the disgusting products that were coming out of those factories. We also see that there is government reform when it comes to the political sphere in America. We see the end of political machines and more voter participation, thanks to things like the initiative, the recall, the referendum, the 17th Amendment, which allowed for direct election of senators. We see more people's voices in the government at various levels, local and federal. We also saw some economic reform, so labor laws that prohibited child labor, guaranteed an 8 or a 10-hour workday for some workers. We saw trust busting going on, right? The Sherman Antitrust Act and the Clayton Antitrust Act. Both of those laws were designed to break up trusts, allowing for more economic competition and lower prices. We saw consumer protection. We had the Meat Inspection Act that created guidelines for meatpacking plants and their cleanliness standards. We also had the Pure Food and Drug Act, which required that all manufacturers put truthful and accurate ingredients on their food and in their medications. And we also saw that there was some currency stability and stability for the economy in America with the creation of the Federal Reserve. We saw expanded citizenship and suffrage rights for various groups of people. The 19th Amendment granted female suffrage. We also saw with the Supreme Court case US v. Wong Kim Ark that birthright citizenship was expanded to the children of immigrants who were born on US soil as well. And then lastly, we saw the growth of Black activism and Black pride in the Progressive Era. Activists like Ida B. Wells exposing lynching, Booker T. Washington, W.B. Du Bois, Marcus Garvey, the creation of the NAACP. These are all important people and accomplishments of this time period. But despite all these successes, there were definitely failures. And it has a lot to do with discrimination of a variety of minority groups in the United States that continues throughout the 20th century and definitely contributes to our racial climate in the US today. So during the Progressive Era, we saw de jure discrimination was strengthened. Remember, de jure discrimination is discrimination through laws and by the government. During the Progressive Era, these Redeemer Democrats, these racist governments are continuing to gain more power in the South. An example of this that hits close to home in North Carolina is the Wilmington Race Riot. It was in 1898. Basically, a Republican government was overthrown by Redeemer Democrats. And back in the day, the Republican Party was still the party coming out of like the Civil War, trying to continue on Lincoln's beliefs. And it was officially overthrown in Wilmington and in North Carolina by those Redeemer Democrats, gaining power again after the Civil War. During the Wilmington Race Riot, there were numerous lynchings. There was the destruction of Black property and businesses in Wilmington, and eventually just a loss of Black political power in the city as well. And in 1898, Wilmington was the largest city in North Carolina, and once it fell into the hands of these Redeemer Democrats, North Carolina officially entered the Jim Crow era too. We saw a Supreme Court case that is probably one of the biggest mistakes made by the Supreme Court. It was called Plessy v. Ferguson. It was decided in 1896. It officially declared that separate but equal facilities were constitutionally okay. So it basically creates the groundwork that allows Jim Crow laws and racial segregation to continue throughout the 20th century. This Supreme Court decision is on the books all the way until 1954, when it's overturned with Brown v. Board of Education, which says that schools in the United States have to desegregate. We also just saw the continued pervasiveness of Jim Crow laws and disenfranchisement tactics across the South, but also across the United States, prohibiting many Black Americans, but also many minorities from voting. And we see the rise of redlining. So, redlining is a practice of prohibiting Black Americans from living in certain areas that were predominantly white. Um, and it wasn't like passing laws that said, Black people can't live here. It was a little bit more complex than that. What would happen is like banks would deny housing loans to Black families, making it difficult for them to live in predominantly white areas. But then they would go and give the same loans to white families who couldn't afford to live in these areas but could if they had a loan. So basically, it's forcing segregation in cities by not allowing Black Americans to live in certain areas. This practice of redlining is going to continue through the 20th century. It is one of the reasons why most major towns or cities in the US continue to basically be racially segregated. Um, and it prevented Black families from gaining generations of wealth and social mobility because owning property was a way to gather wealth. And if Black Americans weren't able to get loans to buy property and houses, it denied them the ability to generate wealth that they could then pass on to future generations. So we'll come back to redlining in other units, but know that it starts during this progressive era and basically creates really segregated cities across the United States. And there's a picture of that over here with these different colors representing different races of people living in the city. We also saw that there was strengthened de facto discrimination. Remember, that is discrimination that is enforced through society and just the people in society. So racial etiquette, or these informal rules for how Black Americans should act, that was enforced nationwide through lynchings and other racial violence and intimidation tactics. And then also we saw discrimination in the West, which we haven't really touched on that much so far. This is going to be more focused towards Chinese immigrants that were in large numbers in the West, as well as Mexican American immigrants and Native Americans. So when it comes to Chinese Americans, we see that there was the Chinese Exclusion Act, which banned most Chinese immigration to the United States. That's not going to be repealed until after World War II. Then we saw that there was increased discrimination against Mexican workers. They're forced into a system of what's called debt peonage. It's really similar to sharecropping in the sense that these Mexican workers, who were typically like migrant workers on farms, they are hired by a wealthy landowner or a wealthy like company owner, and they are not paid in wages. They are paid in paying back their debts. So the debt could be like transportation to and from work every day. Well, instead of getting a paycheck, then your transportation cost was covered. Well, the problem with that is that you never make any extra money to actually get out of debt. And so it kept these Mexican workers in debt for many, many, many years. And then with Native Americans, they were ultimately not granted citizenship rights or any protections during the Progressive era, and they're continued to be forced to assimilate to white American traditions through the Dawes Act and through Native American boarding schools. So the images on this slide, this is a image of some Mexican workers in the West. They were victims of debt peonage. And then down here, we see this is a political cartoon that we looked at in Unit 1 that has a Chinese immigrant who is being excluded from entering the gates of liberty. This is showing the Chinese Exclusion Act. So hopefully you were able to see through the Progressive era that there definitely were some positive changes in fixing some of the issues of the Gilded Age, but there were lots of issues that still remain to be fixed in the 20th century that we are even still grappling with today, largely around the issue of civil rights and racial issues.